as we saw yesterday with this bombing of Moscow, unprecedented. And another thing which was quite different is in the West, the Western countries, they don't seem to work very hard anymore to conceal their own participation. I remember in the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you had people like Baerbock saying, "Listen, we shouldn't turn on each other. We are at war with Russia," and this was deeply problematic because we shouldn't say these things. But now we see all the weapons coming, the intelligence. I mean, the use of NATO territory. But now, of course, this massive strike on, well, last year, not just on Russia's nuclear deterrent, but now this massive bombing of Moscow. And, it's, I mean, the NATO footprint here is very obvious. It's advertised almost. I mean, how are you seeing this? Because I guess of all things, this is what's keeping me up at night. The what seems to be a march towards what would be a massive war with Russia, which I can't conceive the possibility of us having any escalation control, and it would spiral very quickly into a nuclear war. Maybe I'm pessimistic, but this is
No,
madness here.
I think this is what you're saying is very pertinent to everything. Yes, indeed. Let me just say that I think all what happened, the I don't know how many drones and missiles were fired, 156 or something into that refinery in parts of Moscow. I mean, this is the major step up, and it's intended to put Russians on edge, Russians, Muscovites on edge, and people in St. Petersburg on edge, feeling that they're less secure. I think it was also coordinated for, it was pre-coordinated at the EU3, the Euro 3, it's not EU, Euro 3, France, Macron, and Merz meeting. I think it was in London just beforehand, where they put forward their, ultimatums for Russia. And then again, they brought in deliberately, Macron brought in the Zelensky to that meeting and to the European meeting. And I think what we're seeing, therefore, is a major effort by Europe to change the narrative. Macron has said, at the beginning, and he believes that, Trump thought that Russia as a big state would crush Ukraine easily, and that it would be done quickly. This is Macron saying Russia would crush Ukraine, and therefore, there was not really much to do about it because it was going to happen. And then that passed, and we see that Russia still hasn't crushed Ukraine, and the point of these missiles and the point of pushing Zelensky to the sort of front of stage at these two meetings was to say to Trump, look, it's all changed. They're not on the back foot, they're on the front foot. They are winning. No, it's not true. Of course, we know it's not true. It was a huge effort to get together that amount of missiles. And, overall, these attacks on refineries have done little strategic damage to Russia. The economy is not in any sort of free fall. In fact, the economy is growing and employment is increasing. So it's a false narrative, but they were intent on stage managing it with Zelensky, and so the whole of that thing was about the G7 and about the EU summit that was going to take place, that has taken place in these last days, because the summit was going to look at EU budgets and financial resources. And there's a big division in Europe about whether, to agree to this huge budget that is being proposed by the Commission, with some states objecting to. So, I mean, the aim is to push for more defense resources going to Ukraine in the first instance. Secondly, to lay down the framework that Europe wants, and which is ceasefire, then Britain, France, and other states of the willing will take part in peacekeeping. So NATO will move into Ukraine. Ukraine will become part of NATO, eventually an EU. And the main element of it is to bring America into this agreement and into this process, to bring America back to Europe by saying, look, we've done our part, we're doing it. Look, you see what's happening, and Zelensky was showing photographs of the cathedral and how the Russians had destroyed this cathedral in Kiev. In fact, it was probably a Patriot missile that misfired that did damage, but it doesn't matter. The public relations went that way. And so, yes, this is where we are moving, and we will have to see how Putin, he has to respond. He has to respond to it. And the question is, are we moving closer to them responding in the way that Sergei Karaganov and others, like Dmitry Trenin and others at St. Petersburg conference, were saying, the only thing that will stop this ratchet, this escalation, every time, further and further. And I mean, one of the agreements that came out of that trilateral meeting, more preparation, more missiles, more drones, joint what they call co-production, which means that they just ship over the parts for reassemble in Ukraine, and then Ukraine fires it at Russia. How do you put a stop to this? And this is the debate in Russia, and I think it's edging closer and closer to what I described, I think, to Karaganov's argument. The problem is that they don't believe that we will react. We being Russia, it's all said, that's just Putin's bluff. I mean, don't take it seriously. He's not going to do anything because we're NATO, Article 5. And the Russians and Putin, I think, believes that Article 5 is the bluff, that, that if there was an attack, and I think Aragonov on your program argued quite forcefully and directly that he really doubted that America would intervene, even if a tactical nuclear weapon was used against the European NATO state, that they would intervene. And Professor Mearsheimer, if I recall correctly, agreed with him. He thought that that the United States would not necessarily directly become involved. But both agreed also that this could lead to something much worse, that this could escalate and go out. And I think all we've seen in these last days is Europe trying to get to the position where they have, I think it was Macron or something, said they want to create Ukraine as the male fist at the front of European military and NATO military architecture against Russia. That it is to be the front line, putting pressure and attacking Russia behind it. Now, I'm hugely skeptical of these stories, and I've said that in Moscow. I don't believe Europe has the ability to build a military architecture. You can't, when I hear 1997 or 1930, it takes 20 years to do supply lines, to build a real military infrastructure that is being, let alone they don't even have the men. I mean, you can see, look at the UK. it can't even provide a naval vessel at the moment. It can't provide. It's got something like 40 tanks that are serviceable. I mean, the European defense structures are in terrible state, really terrible state. You don't change that in 3 years. And anyway, much of this money is just, one of these boondoggles. The money is going to existing European defense contractors, and their share prices is going up. And a lot of people are going to make a lot of money sort of going in and out, insider trading on who's going to get, the defense money. So it's rather like, what's been happening in Washington, I think, with, the oil futures. With, just before Trump makes an announcement, then, there's the big, sale of purchase of oil futures. And then he makes the announcement, peace. And then, I think there's an element of this taking place in the European context too. So I don't think it's so. What they really want is, if I can make a strange comparison, but I would say it's rather akin, if you think of Europe as being Israel. Israel is using Lebanon as an attempt to pull in, and has been pull in America on its side in a war against Iran. And Europe, in a similar way, is doing this with, just as Israel is doing attacks inside Lebanon and taking towns and leveling them. Europe is using missiles into deep Russia in order to say to America, look, we can win this. We've set the framework for it. We can win this. All we need to do is pull you into this, stand by the condition that, Russia has to capitulate and withdraw from all of the sovereign territory of it and pay compensation and put up its officials for war crimes trials. I mean, Europe is moving very fast through the European Council to arrange all of the means for, war crimes trials and reparations, assessing, keeping lists of damage so they can charge Russia the cost of all these things. I don't think this is going to fly at all. I mean, Putin clearly understands it. I read a statement that Lavrov was going to put it in Politico. I don't know if you've seen it, but a very strong account of the system. Politico refused to publish it, I think, in the end. But I mean,
the foreign ministry published it in Russia.
Oh, they have. They have. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it's a very strong article, a very strong piece. I suggest people read it because it's very clear, gives a very clear indication. So now we know very clearly where things are. The Europeans are pulling Trump, and they were very pleased with the G7 meeting because they got him actually to sit with Zelensky, and they, got him to sort of more or less agree with the European position, which is there must be immediate ceasefire, total sovereignty return to Ukraine. All of these maximalist demands of Europe, they are maximalists. Russia would never agree to any of these. So they got in Russia, trying to get this as the accepted consensus, and to try and pull America in that consensus. And then if they can, pull America into supporting their war, into going to war against Russia with Europe. That's been, the German, the French, and British aim is to get a war against Russia, in which, like in the Second World War, they pull in Roosevelt, not pull in Trump, find the initiative to, then it was Pearl Harbor, or whatever it was, to pull America into their war against Russia. It would be catastrophic. I mean, this is the plan that is catastrophic, and people should understand how dangerous it is, how catastrophic it could be. It could end up because Russia will not tolerate it. I was very struck by what was said about Germany in your on your program by Karagonov, who does know about the nuclear issues. I mean, he has been involved in this for years, decades. And, and he said, we will not tolerate Germany assuming having nuclear weapons. We would eliminate it first. It was a very tough comment. I mean, we are playing with fire, I think. So I agree with you. What's happened there, what happened at the G7, at the European meeting, and no one seems to sort of be aware, all the talk in Europe is how disgraceful it was that Costa's chief of staff actually spoke to someone in Moscow without telling von der Leyen. I mean, he is actually the president of the council, and in case the Europeans have forgotten, it is the member states that decide foreign policy, not the Commission and not the foreign high representative. It's water off a duck's back to them. They just go on anyway.
Yeah, but what you said before, though, I agree. I think this is the goal by the Europeans, that is to have Ukraine standing in front of them and the Americans standing behind. This is how they will seek to weaken Russia over the next years and decades. But
still, I mean, I think, maybe you ought to get someone on the program who can answer this. And I mean, even in Israel now, people are saying, there was no discussion about, an attack on Iran. There was no one, from the Mossad or military, Amman, the military intelligence or anyone that, came when all of this was being discussed and said, but what happens if Iran survives and emerges stronger? Nobody said anything. And if they did think it, they kept their mouths shut. And I think the same question should be asked of the Europeans. What do you conceive a war on Russia would look like? Would it be ground troops? Would it be simply a nuclear war? Would it be, how would you run it? I mean, are you going to mass troops, and would it be a conventional war, or would it be an asymmetrical war, and it would be led by Ukraine in this way? And what would be the outcome? I mean, when you see that, the NATO states are sort of practicing by building prisoner of war camps in parts of it, I mean, it's just nuts. But I have no sense of what, if Europe thinks about what it's trying to do beyond the big picture of, putting pressure on Russia, bringing America back to Europe, getting Europe to give more money and more weapons to Ukraine. I mean, what would war with Russia mean in practical terms? Would it be an air war? Would it be a ground war? Would it just be a nuclear war? It's a question that never seems to be addressed, perhaps because no one wants to address it, because just like no one in Israel wanted to seem, other than, we're part of the team. We're going to go and get wingtip to wingtip with the Americans and going to destroy Iran. Wingtip with the Americans, we're going to go in and destroy Russia.
yeah, I think this is the problem. They often think that the war is simply going to be, yes, something low intensity that they can control. I think they often miss out on why Russia hasn't retaliated against the European countries yet, or against NATO in general, because once they do, the Russians also understand that there is no escalation control anymore. It's going to be impossible, and most likely it would escalate into an all-out war where nuclear weapons could quickly be introduced. I mean, and it's still the idea is that if you can just push the Russians a bit more, and once a war breaks out, like the Dutch are building like in camps for Russian prisoners and all this. I mean, I often make this point: how exactly do you think this war is going to play out? Once it starts, it's not going to be able to be controlled. The idea that Russian soldiers would go into Europe, the Europeans would capture them, send them to Dutch camps. I mean, it's so obscene, but it's not even within propaganda. They actually believe this. Otherwise, why would they build these camps? They actually think this is how the war will be fought. It does beg the question, though, like is anyone actually behind the wheel on this one? Because this is absurd.
This is the question. Like it's now come out in Israel. No one was asking that sort of question. And the same thing I would say, the whole of the strategy is based on the European conviction that Russia would and must capitulate. It would have no choice against the combined force of Europe, so many countries, such a big GDP, such a military strength of NATO, that it would have no choice. And just as what happened in Iran reflected a complete misunderstanding of the nature of the Iranians, the character of the Iranians. So such a conviction that Russia was going to capitulate or would easily capitulate is a complete misunderstanding of Russia and Russia's consciousness of their history with Europe.